It was raining hard that night. The streets were almost empty, except for the sound of water running through the drains. James walked with his shoulders hunched, trying to keep his jacket dry. He had just finished a long shift at the factory, and all he wanted was to get home. But then he heard something. A soft sound, almost lost in the rain. It was like a whimper. Mixed with a cough, James stopped. He looked around, not sure if he had imagined it. The sound came again, this time a little louder. It was coming from a narrow alley between two old buildings. Most people in this part of town stayed away from alleys at night. But James had never been the kind of man to ignore someone in trouble. He stepped into the alley, the rain dripping from the edges of his hair. At first, he saw only shadows. Then, in the dim light of a flickering street lamp, he noticed movement. Two small figures were huddled behind a big metal bin. They were shaking, their heads pressed close together. Their clothes were soaked and torn. One of them let out a small cough that sounded painful. James moved closer and saw their faces. They weren't human. Their skin was pale with a faint silver glow under the rain. Their eyes were too large, and their ears were pointed slightly backward. They looked no older than 10 or 11. Both stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. James raised his hand slowly to show he meant no harm. "Hey, it's okay," he said gently. They didn't respond, just pressed closer together. He could see they were freezing. Their lips trembled, and their thin fingers clutched at each other for warmth. James took off his jacket and knelt down. "You'll catch your death out here," he murmured. He draped the jacket over their shoulders. One of them flinched, but didn't pull away. The other glanced at him with a mix of fear and confusion. James pulled out the sandwich he had been saving for later. It wasn't much, just bread and cheese, but it was all he had. He unwrapped it and offered it to them. For a moment, neither moved. Then the smaller one slowly reached out, took the sandwich, and began eating in small, desperate bites. The other followed, both of them chewing like they hadn't eaten in days. James felt something heavy settle in his chest. He couldn't just leave them here. He knew nothing about aliens, nothing about where they came from, but right now, they were just too cold. "Hungry kids, come on," he said softly. "You can't stay here." They shook their heads. James guessed they didn't understand his words, so he tried a different approach. He gestured toward the street, then to himself, then made a roof shape with his hands. The taller one hesitated, glancing at the smaller. Finally, they both stood up slowly. They were barefoot, their feet red from the cold. James took off his scarf and wrapped it around the smaller one's head. The rain poured harder as they stepped out of the alley. James led them through the wet streets, glancing back to make sure they were following. When they reached his tiny apartment, he opened the door and waved them in. They hesitated on the threshold, dripping water onto the floor. James smiled and nodded, stepping back to give them space. They finally stepped inside, looking around nervously. The apartment was small, just one bedroom, a kitchen, and a living area, but it was warm. James quickly found an old blanket and wrapped it around both of them. They sat together on the couch, still close. Still watching him carefully, James turned on the heater and put a pot of soup on the stove. The smell soon filled the room. He handed them each a bowl, and they ate quickly. Every now and then, they glanced up at him, as if trying to decide if he was safe. James didn't ask questions. He didn't care if they were human or alien, rich or poor right now. They were just children who needed help when they finished eating. The smaller one let out a soft sigh and leaned against the taller one. Their eyes began to close. James gave them his bed and took the couch. As he lay there, listening to the rain on the roof, he thought about the fear in their eyes. He wondered who had hurt them and why they were alone. But he told himself he'd find answers later. For now, they were safe. He didn't know that. This night, this simple choice to help would change his life forever, and one day, it would bring a starship to his door. The next morning, James woke to the smell of rain still in the air. The apartment was quiet for a moment. He wondered if the two girls had slipped away during the night, but when he peeked into his bedroom, they were there, still curled up together under the blanket, sleeping deeply. The smaller one's hand was gripping the edge of the blanket like she was afraid someone might take it away. James let them sleep. He brewed a pot of coffee for himself and thought about what to do. He didn't know their names, their language, or where they had come. From all he knew was they were alone. And he had no plan to send them back into the streets. Later that day, the girls woke up slowly. Their eyes darted around the room like they were checking to make sure it was still safe. James smiled and offered them some bread with jam. The smaller one sniffed it suspiciously before taking a bite. The taller one followed a second later. It was awkward at first. None of them could speak the same language. But kindness didn't need many words. James began pointing to things in the room, saying the English words slowly. Chair, he said, tapping the chair. Table, he said, pointing to the table. The smaller girl tilted her head and repeated, tea. Able, her voice soft but clear. James grinned. That was the first step. By the end of the week, they had learned a few more words. Water, food, yes, no. They didn't tell him their real names. But they seemed to accept the ones he gave them. The smaller one he called Lyra, because her voice reminded him of a gentle song. The taller one he called Nea, a name that just felt right. They didn't object. And soon they responded whenever he called them. It became their little home together. Lyra loved sitting by the window and watching the rain. Naya preferred helping in the kitchen, even if she burned the toast every single time. At night, James noticed something. Sometimes, Lyra would wake up suddenly, breathing fast. She would clutch Naya's arm and whisper, in their language. Naya would hold her until she calmed down. James wanted to ask what was wrong, but he knew they weren't ready to tell him. Instead, he made sure the door was locked and kept a small flashlight by their bed in case they were scared of the dark. One afternoon, James took them to the market. It was a small place with food stalls and second-hand clothing shops. People stared when they saw the girls. Not many aliens came through this part of town. James ignored the stares and bought them each a proper pair of shoes. When Lyra put hers on, she grinned so wide it made James's chest ache. For the first time, she didn't have to walk barefoot on the cold ground. As weeks passed, they began to trust him more. Sometimes, Naya would laugh when James told a joke, even if she didn't understand all the words. Lyra started drawing on scraps of paper, strange symbols and patterns James didn't recognize. He guessed they were from her home. One evening, while James was washing dishes, he noticed the girl standing in the doorway. Naya said something softly, then pointed to her chest. Knee. Yeah, she said. Then she pointed at her sister Lee. James realized they were finally telling him their real names. It was a small gift, but it felt important. He smiled and repeated their names, and they both nodded. That night, he fell asleep with a strange feeling in his heart. He didn't know it yet, but he had become more than just a stranger who helped them. He was their protector, their teacher, their family. But danger was never far away. A month later, James was walking home from work when he noticed a black van parked near his building. Two men in dark coats were standing by it, scanning the street. He felt a cold weight in his stomach. Something told him they weren't there by accident. When he got upstairs, Lyra and Naya were sitting quietly at the table. They didn't smile this time. Instead, Naya glanced out the window and whispered something in their language to Lyra. James didn't need to understand the words. He could see the fear in their eyes. He didn't know who was looking for them. But he knew one thing for sure. If those men tried to take the girls, they would have to go through him first. What James couldn't guess was that this quiet life they had built together was running out of time. The past Lyra and Naya had tried. So hard to escape was catching up, and when it finally reached them, the sky itself would come alive the next time strangers came for the girls. They wouldn't be arriving in a van, they would be arriving in a ship so large it would block out the sun. It was late afternoon when James heard the knock on the door. It wasn't the soft, polite kind of knock. It was heavy, sharp, the kind that made the wood shudder. James froze halfway through chopping vegetables. Lyra and Naya looked up from the couch, their eyes already wide. Another knock came, louder this time. James set the knife down and wiped his hands on a towel. "Stay here," he said quietly, though he knew they didn't fully understand. Still, they didn't move. They just watched him with nervous, unblinking eyes. When James opened the door, two men stood there. They were tall, dressed in black coats, with a look that made his skin crawl. One of them held a small device that blinked with a faint blue light. The other pulled a folded picture from his pocket and held it up. "Have you seen these girls?" the man asked, his voice flat and cold. James's heart thumped hard. The photo was blurry, but there was no mistaking the faces. It was Lyra and Naya, only younger. He forced a neutral look onto his face. "No," he said, "never seen them." The man stared at him for a long moment, like he was trying to read his mind. Then he slipped the photo back into his pocket. "If you do," the man said, "call this number." He handed James a small card, the kind you didn't want in your pocket. James nodded, closed the door, and locked it. The moment the lock clicked, he turned to see Lyra and Naya standing there. They didn't need to understand the words. His face told them enough. Lyra clutched Naya's sleeve. Naya moved quickly to the window and peeked outside. James followed her gaze. The black van was still there, parked just far enough away to look casual, but he knew better. They're watching. James muttered under his breath. That night, James barely slept. Every sound from the street made him sit up. He kept thinking about the way the man had looked at him, like he knew James was lying. By morning, he had made a decision. When the girls woke up, he told them slowly. Using gestures that they had to leave, he packed a small bag with food, clothes, and a little cash. The girls didn't argue. It was like they had been expecting this moment all along. Naya touched his arm and said something in her language. Her voice was low but urgent. James didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. Danger was close. They left the apartment through the back stairs. James kept them close, his eyes scanning every shadow. They moved through side streets and alleys, avoiding the main roads, but somehow, James couldn't shake the feeling they were being followed. Every time he glanced behind them, he caught a glimpse of movement, just enough to keep his heart racing. By nightfall, they reached the edge of the industrial district. James had a friend who owned an old warehouse there. It wasn't much, but it was out of sight. They hid in a dusty office space above the main floor. The air smelled of oil and rust, but at least it was dry. Lyra sat on the floor, hugging her knees. Naya stood at the window, keeping watch. James leaned against the wall, trying to think, who were those men? Why were they looking for two girls who had been hiding on Earth for years? And why did the girls look more scared than ever? Hours passed in silence until James heard something. It was faint at first, a low hum in the distance. It didn't sound like a car or a truck. It was deeper, smoother, like nothing James had ever heard before. Naya's head snapped toward the sound. She said something sharp to Lyra, who immediately stood up. James's pulse quickened. "What is it?" he asked, even though he knew they couldn't answer. The humming grew louder, and now the floor beneath them seemed to tremble slightly. They moved to the window. Out in the night sky, something massive was moving between the clouds. For a moment, James thought it might be a plane, but then the shape came into focus. Huge craft, glowing faintly with blue and gold lights. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. The hum grew into a deep vibration that seemed to fill the air. Lyra grabbed James's sleeve, her eyes wide-not with fear this time. But something else, hope. But before James could ask what was happening, the warehouse door below them burst open. The men in black coats rushed inside. Flashlights cutting through the dark, Nia grabbed Lyra's hand, and James moved in front of them. They had nowhere to run. He was just a man with no weapons, no plan. But he wasn't about to let anyone take the girls. The hum outside grew into a roar. The building shook as a bright beam of light broke through the ceiling. The men froze, shielding their eyes. Lyra and Nea's faces lit up in the glow. In that moment, James realized this wasn't the end of the danger. This was only the beginning, and whatever was happening now, it was something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The beam of light from above was so bright it turned the dusty warehouse into a place of gold. The men in black staggered backward, shielding their eyes. James could barely see, but he felt the deep vibration in the floor grow stronger. It was like standing inside the chest of a giant and hearing its heartbeat. The roof above them cracked, and a round section lifted away as if pulled by invisible hands. Through the opening, James saw it. A ship so massive it blocked the stars. Its hull shimmered with silver and deep blue, glowing faintly with lines of gold that seemed to move like rivers of light. The sound it made was not loud, but it was powerful. It was the sound of something ancient and alive. The beam narrowed, focusing on James, Lyra, and Nea. It wasn't harsh, felt warm on his skin. The men in black shouted into their radios, their voices breaking with panic. One of them aimed a weapon, but before he could fire, a wave of force swept through the warehouse. It knocked the men off their feet, but left James and the girls standing. James looked at Lyra, and for the first time since he had met her, she wasn't afraid. She stepped forward into the beam, her small hand reaching upward like she was greeting an old friend. Nea followed, her posture straight and proud. James hesitated, glancing at the men who were slowly getting up. Then Lyra turned back to him, her eyes meeting his. She didn't speak, but he understood the message: come with us. The light wrapped around them like a living thing. James felt his feet leave the ground. The warehouse faded below. The men's shouts became distant. Wind rushed past him, but the light held him steady. Moments later, his boots touched something solid again. The beam faded, and James found himself standing on a wide platform made of polished silver. The air was crisp and clean, smelling faintly of something sweet. He turned slowly, trying to take in what he was seeing. They were inside the ship. It wasn't just metal, and machines. Its walls seemed alive, softly pulsing with light. Tall archways opened into halls that curved away like flowing rivers. Symbols glowed faintly on the floor, shifting like water under glass. In front of them stood a group of figures. They were tall, their armor made of the same shimmering silver as the ship. Their helmets were crested with gold, and long capes flowed behind them. Each carried a weapon that hummed faintly in the quiet air, but none of them raised their arms. Instead, they stepped aside. Bowing low, James blinked, wondering if he had imagined it. He glanced at Lyra, and Neon froze. The two girls had changed. Their ragged earth clothes were gone, replaced by long robes of deep blue and white. Their hair was braided with silver threads, and they stood taller somehow. The air around them seemed to hum differently, even their eyes shone brighter. The soldiers bowed not to James, but to them. A figure stepped forward from the back of the group. She was taller than the rest, her armor more elaborate. Her face was uncovered, and James saw the same silver glow in her skin that Lyra and Nea had. She looked at the girls with warmth in her eyes, then she turned her gaze to James. Her voice was soft but carried the weight of command. "Human," she said in perfect English, "you have sheltered the lost blood of our crown. James stared at her, the words slow to sink in. "Blood of your crown?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. The woman inclined her head toward Lyra and Nea. "They are not orphans," she said. "They are the rightful princesses of the Celery Empire." James felt the deck sway under his feet. Because the ship was moving, but because his mind was. He thought back to the nights they huddled on his couch. The mornings they burned the toast, the way they smiled shyly when they learned new words, princesses. It didn't make sense, and yet, as he looked at them now, standing tall and regal, it was impossible to deny. Lyra took a step toward him, her voice trembling but clear. "You saved us," she said slowly. Each word in English carefully chosen. Nea added, "We come back." "For you," the tall woman raised a hand, and two soldiers approached carrying a long, ornate case. They opened it to reveal a golden pendant, shaped like a star wrapped in silver branches. "This," the woman said, "is the mark of the crown's guardian." She stepped forward and placed it around James's neck. "It is given only once in a generation to the one who saves the life of the royal bloodline." James shook his head slightly, still trying to find words. "I didn't do it for any reward," he said. The woman smiled faintly. "And that is why you deserve it most." Around them, the ship seemed to hum a little louder. Through the high windows, James could see Earth far below, a blue and white jewel in the darkness. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that stepping into that beam of light had changed his life forever, and whatever came next, there was no going back. The silver hall they stood in was silent, except for the low hum of the ship. James could feel the weight of the pendant around his neck. Heavy but warm, Lyra and Nea stood close to him, their eyes softer now, but filled with something deeper than gratitude. The tall woman in armor motioned for them to follow. They walked down a wide corridor where the walls glowed with faint patterns that shifted like starlight through water. At the end was a chamber with a round table, its surface made of crystal that shimmered when touched. The woman gestured for James to sit. He hesitated, feeling out of place among such grand surroundings, but Lyra smiled and nodded at him. He sat, and the truth began to unfold. The woman introduced herself as Captain Serenia, commander of the Royal Guard. Her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of history. 12 years ago, she began, the Celery Empire suffered a great betrayal. James listened as she told him about a night of fire and blood. An enemy faction had launched a sudden coup, striking at the heart of the empire. The royal palace was attacked without warning. The emperor and empress were killed, and their two young daughters Lyra and Neo were taken. The attackers knew that without heirs, the royal bloodline would be broken. They planned to use the children as bargaining tools, or worse, but a loyal servant had smuggled them off the planet in the chaos. Their escape ship was damaged in the fight and drifted for weeks before crashing on a remote part of Earth. James felt the hair on his arms rise. He thought back to the night he had found them cold, wet, shivering behind a trash bin. They had been through all of that before they met him. Lyra's voice broke the heavy silence on Earth. "We hide," she said slowly, her accent soft but clear. "Men come. Many times," she added, glancing at Nea. "They want. Take us back, not to home. To bad place." James realized those strange men in the black coats were part of that faction. They had been hunting the girls for years, trying to finish what they had started. Nea's hands curled into fists as she spoke. "We run, always run. Then we meet you," she said. She looked right at James, her silver eyes bright. "You stay." James felt his throat tightened. He had only given them food, warmth, and a safe place. But to them, it had meant everything. Captain Serenia continued. "For years, we searched every possible world, following fragments of reports. Whispers of sightings," she said. We feared you had been lost forever." She looked at James. "When the signal came from Earth 2 weeks ago, we moved with all speed, but the enemy was already close." James remembered the black van, the men watching his apartment. If the ship had been even a day later, things could have ended very differently. The captain placed a small holographic device on the table. It lit up, showing a scene of the Sealar homeworld towers of crystal, rising over oceans of silver blue water. Skies filled with ships, shaped like birds in flight. "This is their home," she said quietly. James stared at the image, almost unable to believe the girls had come from a place so beautiful. They have been in exile too long. Serenia continued, "By law, they must return to take their place as rulers of the empire." Lyra reached across the table and took James's hand. "You come with us," she said, her voice certain. James blinked, unsure he had heard her right. "Nay." Leaned forward. "You." "Our family," she said, each word like a promise. Serenia nodded. "It is their wish," she said, "and the council will honor it. For you are now the guardian of the crown." James sat back, trying to take it all in. A part of him wanted to refuse. This was their world, their fight, not his. But another part of him knew he couldn't just walk away. He had promised, all those years ago, to keep them safe, and maybe now. That promise meant more than ever. The captain's voice softened. "You must understand, Guardian. The enemy will not stop," she said. "They have not given up in 12 years, and they will not give up now." Her eyes narrowed slightly, "but they will think twice." "Knowing the princesses are under your protection," James glanced at the girls. They were no longer the frightened children he had once found. They were strong now, ready to face their destiny. But beneath all the royal robes and titles, he still saw the 2 kids who had sat at his kitchen table, eating toast and giggling when he dropped the butter knife. He smiled faintly. "All right," he said, "I'm coming with you." Lyra's face lit up with a smile that reached her eyes. Nia's shoulders relaxed for the first time since they had left Earth. Serenia inclined her head in approval. Then, "Prepare yourself," she said. "Your life among the stars begins now." Through the wide windows of the chamber, James saw the stars shifting. The ship was turning, its nose pointing toward a distant cluster of golden light. Somewhere out there was a planet of oceans and crystal towers. Somewhere out there was a new chapter waiting for all 3 of them. And James had no idea just how much his life was about to change. The royal ship drifted through the Black Sea. Of stars, Earth was now only a fading blue dot behind them. James stood by the viewing deck, his hands resting on the smooth silver rail. He had never been in space before. The quiet here was different from Earth, was deep, endless, like the air itself was listening. Lyra and Nea stood on either side of him, their robes moving gently with the hum of the ship. Neither spoke for a long time. It was as if all 3 were letting the silence wrap around them. Finally, Lyra turned to him. Her silver blue eyes caught the glow of the starlight. "You saved us," she said slowly, carefully choosing each English word. "You give home." Family. Nea stepped forward, her voice steady. "We wish give you something. It's not just gift." James raised an eyebrow, unsure what they meant. "You already gave me more than I could ever ask for," he said quietly. But they shook their heads. Lyra glanced at her sister before speaking again. "In celery law, one who saves life of crown may be joined to crown forever." James frowned slightly. "Joined? How?" he asked. Naya's lips curved into a small smile. "You become part of family, not just title, but blood and name." James blinked, realizing the weight of her words. "You mean adoption?" he asked. Lyra hesitated, then said, "More than adoption. In our world, we join heart and fate. Captain Serenia, who had been standing quietly nearby, stepped forward. "It is called the Binding of Honor," she said. "It means the Guardian becomes more than a protector. He becomes kin by oath, bound to the royal house for life." Her gaze softened. "It also means you will never be alone again. For the Empire will call you one of its own." James leaned back against the rail. A rush of thoughts filled his mind, his small apartment. The quiet mornings, the lonely nights, before he met the girls. The offer was more than just a position or a medal, it was a place to belong. He looked at Lyra and Nea in their faces. He still saw the two frightened children he had once carried home in the rain. And yet now they stood as leaders of 1,000 worlds, offering him a place beside them. "I don't know if I'm the right man for this," he admitted. "I'm not a soldier. I'm not." Royal Lyra stepped closer, placing her small hand over his. "You are." "More," she said. "You cared when no one else did." Naya nodded. "Empire has soldiers." But only one James. James felt a lump in his throat. He wasn't used to hearing words like that. On Earth, he was just another face in the crowd. But here, to them, he was someone worth honoring. He thought about what might happen if he said no. He could go back to his old life, work his factory shifts, and watch the news about strange alien politics from afar. But the thought felt empty, because his life had already changed the night he found them. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was part of their story. He nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "If I'm joining your family, I do it because I want to protect you, not because of the title." Lyra's face lit up. Nea let out a rare, soft laugh. Captain Serenia gave a slight bow of respect. "Then it shall be written," she said. That night, a small ceremony was held in the ship's central hall. It wasn't grand like James expected. No crowds, no blinding lights, just the royal sisters, Captain Serenia, and a few elders who had traveled with them. A silver band was placed around his wrist, marked with the same flowing symbols that glowed on the ship's walls. "This binds you to the House of Solari," one elder said in a deep voice. "Your name will be remembered as long as our stars burn." When the band locked into place, James felt a warmth spread up his arm, not heat, something gentler. Like the comfort of a hand on his shoulder, Lyra and Nea each took one of his hands. "In our heart," Lyra whispered. "In our home," Nea added. They spoke a final phrase in their own language, the meaning of which James didn't understand, but somehow he felt it. It was a promise. Later, back at the viewing deck, James stood between them, looking out at the glowing horizon of stars. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like an outsider. He didn't feel like a man drifting without direction. He had a place now. And whatever lay ahead, be it danger or peace, he would face it with them. Far in the distance, a golden star burned brighter than the others. That Serenia's voice came from behind them. "Is Solarian your new home?" James took a deep breath. Somewhere out there, people were waiting for their rulers to return. And somewhere out there, his new life was waiting to begin. The royal starship glided through the darkness. Ahead, the golden star of Solarian grew brighter with every passing hour. James stood at the viewing deck with Lyra and Nea beside him. The silver band on his wrist still felt warm. He kept running, his thumb over the flowing symbols engraved into it. It wasn't just jewelry, it was the mark of his new life. The hum of the engines was steady and calm. Every now and then, small streaks of light flashed by their ships, smaller ones bowing away from their path. Captain Serenia had told him that when the royal crest traveled through space, no one dared block its way as they drew closer. James could see Solarian in full. It was unlike anything he had imagined. The oceans were a shimmering silver blue, almost glowing. Great crystal spires rose like mountains from the surface, catching the sunlight and scattering it in rainbow arcs. Massive floating platforms drifted in the air above the cities, connected by thin bridges of light. The skies were full of elegant ships shaped like birds and blades. It looked less like a planet and more like something out of a dream. The ship began to descend. Below, James could see a massive plaza surrounded by towers of white crystal. Thousands of people filled the open space, their silver skin and shimmering robes catching the sunlight. The closer they got, the more James realized they weren't just gathered. Out of curiosity, they were waiting, and they were waiting for Lyra and Nea when the ship's ramp lowered. A sound like a wave rose from the crowd. It wasn't shouting knights, it was a deep, rhythmic chant. The people were calling their names. James followed the sisters down the ramp. The light was blinding after the ship's soft glow. The air here was crisp and carried the scent of something sweet. The moment Lyra and Nea stepped onto the plaza, the crowd dropped to one knee. James froze, unsure what to do, but before he could follow, Lyra turned, took his hand, and pulled him forward. When they stopped in the center of the plaza, she raised their joined hands high. The crowd's eyes turned to him. Captain Serena's voice carried over the square. "This is James, the guardian of the crown," she declared. The chant changed. Now they were speaking his name. James had never felt so exposed in his life. Yet, not unwelcome, the sisters led him into the grand hall of the palace. The walls were made of living crystal, shifting faintly like water under sunlight. Above them, beams of gold light streamed through a ceiling that looked more like the open sky than stone. At the far end stood a pair of massive thrones carved from white crystal veined with silver. Lyra and Nea climbed the steps and took their places. James stood at the base of the dais. An elder in long robes approached him. "You are bound to the crown," the elder said. "Your name will be in our histories, and your voice will be heard in our councils." It was strange to think that only days ago, James had been just another man on Earth. Now he was being given a place in the ruling seat of an empire. But to him, the real change wasn't the power or the title. It was the fact that Lyra and Nea no longer had to hide. They were home, and they were safe. That evening, a feast was held in his honor. Long tables filled the great hall, covered with dishes he didn't recognize, fruits that glowed faintly, bread that shimmered with golden dust, drinks that changed color when poured. Music filled the air, soft at first, then rising into joyous bursts. Lyra and Nea laughed more than he had ever heard them laugh before. They introduced him to ministers, generals, and scholars. Some bowed to him deeply. Others looked curious, a few even skeptical, but no one dared question the word of the crown as the night drew on. James stepped outside onto a balcony overlooking the city. From here, the lights of Solarian spread out like a field of stars. He could see airships drifting lazily between towers, the silver seas reflecting the twin moons above. For a moment, he thought about his small apartment back on Earth. It felt like a lifetime ago. He remembered the rain, the alley, the two cold girls hiding behind a bin. If he had walked past them that night, his life would have stayed small, but he hadn't. He had stopped, and now he was standing here, on a world 1,000 light years away. Lyra and Nea joined him on the balcony. They didn't speak at first, they didn't need to. Finally, Lyra looked at him. "Home," she said softly. Nea added, "Not just ours. Yours too." James felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't just pride. It wasn't just relief. It was belonging. He put his arms around both of them, pulling them close. And for the first time since he could remember, James truly believed he was exactly where he was meant to be. Above them, the stars burned bright. Ahead of them, the future stretched wide and full of possibility. And whatever came next, peace, danger, adventure, they would face it together. The guardian and the two princesses he had once found in the rain.